welcome to the Day 3 Product Stability Session 2 for TAC 2020. My name is Rohini. I'm hosting this session today. I'm very, very excited to get into today's session and briefly introduce our speaker today. Meghana Parwate. Meghana is an enterprise agile coach and is an expert in agile transformation of large to complex organizations. She's a SAFe program consultant and seasoned IT professional with rich experience in onshore, offshore, diverse global teams and has played successful roles in the PMO. She's volunteered as a reviewer for various conferences and research organizations. She's around 14 publications and is a recipient of several honors and awards for management excellence and technical collaboration. Probably it will take me a whole session to talk about her achievements, but in the interest of time, I would like to hand over the session to Meghana. And I would welcome the participants as well who have joined today's session. And I know it's Sunday evening. Thanks a lot for joining today's session. Please post your questions and we will take your questions at the end of the session. Welcome, Meghana. Over to you.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Rohin. And yes, sometimes even I find it difficult to talk about a lot of things in a short span of time. So just the way Rohini went through the introduction, that happens to all of us. And welcome to the session. I know it's not easy keeping aside our Sunday commitments, requirements, and the likes. I know we have all gathered together to learn something new. So really appreciate everyone that has joined. And let's get started with the topic. Now, let me give you a short disclaimer before we get on. So this is a very vast topic. Typically, when we start implementing domain-driven design, we conduct a series of workshops with particular product teams and the likes. So I'll be more than happy to share a few glimpses which will at least get you started into thinking where you can apply this, how will it make a difference to your product development life cycle, and what can you benefit from it. So I'll give you a few ideas, a few top level points, and preferably also a few talking points to converse in your organization. And of course, we'll spare some time for questions as well in the end. And with that, let's get started. So please give me a hint if you can see my share, and I'll set on the timer so I'm mindful of giving you some time back to also ask questions.
Yeah, we can see it, Meghana.
All right, superb. So let's begin. All right. So there are two things we are going to talk about, and we will see how these blend together and what are the benefits when we have a blend. So we're talking about, in a nutshell, development of products, and we're talking about domain-driven design. Now, both of these are not new concepts. Okay, none of this was definitely emerging or created in this era. Both of them are pretty old. And what makes this unique combination a winning combination? Let's get on to the slides. So before I open the curtains on the agenda overall, I would just like to put up a few points about product development in general. So when we talk about product development, what are we talking about? We're talking about creating something which probably looks like this or probably looks like something else. Don't worry too much about it. But what we're looking at is really creating that particular piece of product or service which solves customers' problems. So we are doing something different, unique, or add-on, which will make a particular workflow or life different for customers. So customer is at the heart. Yeah. And when would customer love and recognize products, appreciate a particular brand? What is brand loyalty as such? That's nothing but those products which solve customers' problems and nothing beyond that. So what would be the interesting mix of this? Products should be such that they neither burden the customer nor make the customer wait endlessly. So it's all about speed, it's all about consistency, and it's also about creating or releasing those features which customers would appreciate. Nothing more, nothing less. So domain-driven design is that interesting set of concepts which help you create products which customers love, because that's where you start from. When you think about domain-driven design, you actually start with the customer. You actually start with, as they say, the problem statement. You actually start with that particular workflow which the customer is at most interested in. And, I would like to go to the next slide with a very interesting quote. And if I remember correctly, this is from Eric Evans. If the design or some central part of it does not map to the domain, then the model is of little value, and correctness of the software itself is a suspect. So with that being said, let's get on to the agenda. And here's what we look at covering in the next 30 odd minutes, to give you some time for questions at the end. What exactly is domain-driven design? We're talking about design. We're talking about something that's intensive to the domain. How does this blend together? Why should you even implement domain-driven design? It's not a silver bullet, but it's really helpful in a few areas. And what would those be? What are the concepts that comprise this? That's really important for you to understand. Some of what I will present will seem extremely trivial on the slides, but the real takeaway or the real success of this presentation will be when you remember this and apply it in your day-to-day work. And last but not the least, we will also look at what has been the interesting action behind this. So, when I say there have been benefits behind implementing this in my organization, where exactly it has helped and what did we do? So I will definitely provide a few aspects of how did it help and what did we do to make it work as well. So let's get started. What is domain-driven design? Well, it's not technology, first and foremost, but it is rather an approach that you take to build something. And what's different about this approach? It's the fact that, whatever you talk about, whether you talk about from a coding standpoint, your class names, class methods, class variables, or you talk about the overall structure, as in your classes and, the methods in the class, the events and everything around it should be something that matches the business domain. Now, in the next slide, and just park your thoughts until that time, we will also see that when we have so many things around us, we all probably understand what unified modeling language is. And, we know n number of other things, more and more things are getting popular in this space time and again. So when we have all of this, why do we need domain-driven design? So we will look at that as well. And the other aspect, very, very important, which makes DDD different from everything else that's available in the technical space, is the fact that DDD recommends the use of common language. I'll definitely want to emphasize on this in more DDD specific terms. It's called ubiquitous language. And the very simple meaning or implementation of this is to speak the same language that the customer knows, that the business users know, as well as the software developers understand and implement. And these concepts in a nutshell give you what DDD is all about. Very, very important is to keep reminding this when you're implementing domain-driven design and keep really using it, which is not easy because you will encounter impediments. The software development, the research and development might not understand the domain as much as the business users do and so on. So there will definitely be roadblocks, but we'll get to that in a bit. And I'll specifically talk about what's a must, what have been the learnings, and how did it really help as a big picture. So with that being said, why exactly domain-driven design when we have everything around us? So domain-driven design really starts with the specific business. It starts with the specific problem statement. It puts emphasis on the problem domain. Now, this is really the punchline of it all. Generally, we have a lot of things around us which we are aware of, which are, yes, domain agnostic, sometimes language agnostic, but they are a lot more technical in nature. They have less focus on, unless there's a conscious thought around it, there's a lot less focus on the problem domain. While DDD wants to turn your implementation starting point the other way around. Never start with the solution domain, rather start with the problem domain. And DDD helps build products which not only reflects something interesting for the customer, but also the biggest advantages it's going to give you is that you have maintainability, scalability, incremental development. I know on a parallel track, sometime in the conference, we have also had or are going to have sessions around emergent design and architecture. So those are really the interesting aspects which blend together when you look at domain-driven design in the context of architecture as well. You will understand that a huge amount of emphasis is on emergent architecture, which nothing but at the bottom line talks about maintainability, scalability, talks about building architecture in steps and one on top of the other and not big bang. And most importantly, which I always elaborate a lot, if you have attended a training with me or a session or any other conference, I think this is one neglected area, one neglected child, which we never give a lot of attention to when we're doing product development. And sincerely, I take it as my personal responsibility to spread this word. Never minimize, never give less attention to your NFRs. They are really your constraints on the backlog, as Scale Agile prefers to call it, or they're really extremely important. Functional requirements are sometimes very easy to acknowledge. Acceptance criteria around them is very easy, but really the non-functional requirements are what needs to be given a much serious thought. And yet again, DDD gives you a very important connection with NFRs. So the focus is on core domain and domain logic, complex designs on models of the domain. So it can get complex when you're implementing it, but the complexity will still give a very interesting outcome, which is what customers would love. Improving the application model, resolving emergent domain-related issues. How does all of this happen? These are probably big terms and a lot of things packed into them, but really at the heart of it is that domain experts work together with the research and development organization. And when I talk about the implementation in my company, I will definitely explicitly focus on this. We have gotten domain experts as business owners on to the particular work item. We have got them on to the release trains. We've got them working together with the R&D team. And this is a very important success factor to the implementation of domain design. So touching upon yet another interesting point. So when we have a lot around us, we have design patterns, we have UMLs, a lot of us know about them. We're experts at these, but there's a fundamental difference. And that, in my honest opinion, is yet another important takeaway from this session. So design patterns, unified modeling language, these are a lot more technical. These do solve some of the important problems. But really, when you start with them, your start is a technical focus. It's much more design and architecture than the customer and the problem domain. So what's important and distinction behind usage of DDD is really to start the other way around, which is start with the customer, with the problem domain. Code as a mechanism of communication, we have seen that there's a lot of technical documentation that gets generated, or even documentation gets generated from code to model, model to code. A lot of things are available. We have seen them. Maybe we are using them day in, day out, but these are all insufficient. And why are these insufficient? Because they are a lot more technical in nature. A singleton pattern, or rather some people prefer to call it an anti-pattern, but that's also a very technical approach of looking at something. Any of the design patterns for that matter, they look at building a repository of the most frequently encountered problems. Yes, definitely agreed. They are a solution to some of the most tricky situations that we encounter. That's also agreed. But we start thinking about their usage more from a technical concept, while DDD asks you to look at the domain first and then the technical aspects. And of course, it's a creative collaboration between technical and domain experts. It's also compatible to a great extent with a lot of things that we have around model-driven architecture and the likes, model-driven engineering. Again, this is an important element of DDD as well, but domain-driven design encourages you not to start with those. So I think we have said enough about the distinctions. Some quotes, very, very interesting ones. Martin Fowler, yet another person whom I really recognize in this field as somebody who has given us a lot of wisdom, a lot of expert guidance. And in his words, as Martin Fowler quotes it, any fool can write code that computer can understand, but good programmers write code that humans can understand. So it's all important that we make things as understandable as possible. Second quote, when the users or domain experts use vocabulary that's nowhere in the design, that's a warning sign. Again, from Eric Evans, yet another guru in this field, and he's the one who has coined the term domain-driven design. He's written multiple books on this subject, and I would really encourage you all to read a couple of his books. One of my personal favorites being Tackling Complexity in the Heart of Software. It's a lot technical, but I'm sure, even if you're not as tech savvy, you will definitely understand, because at least you should cover and go deep into the aspects of domain-driven design from it. The next, pattern is not a cookbook. It lets you start from the base of experience to develop your solution, gives you some language that you're talking about. Last but not the least, isolating the domain implementation. That's absolutely must. All right, with that being said, let's get into what are the elements of domain-driven design? What is it that you need to understand? So there are 4 important things that you should understand, at least at a top level, if you're guiding your organization into getting through domain-driven design, and you need to spread this to your research and development teams and your business owners as well. The first being, we're talking about a specific context. We are never talking about a design that's a one-size-fits-all. We're talking about something specific. So let's set the context. Let's define where a particular problem holds and where does the solution hold as well. Domain, needless to say, it's extremely important. The subject matter, the subject area. Then comes the model. Now, this can be in the form of a model-driven design or any other thing, or even on digital whiteboards, you can successfully make your models. And last but not the least, the common language, which is also called ubiquitous language between domain experts and developers. These are the 4 really must-do things inside a domain-driven design implementation. So focusing on ubiquitous language in particular, this is something which is as is put from the web, and hence the disclaimer, featured snippet from the web. It's a universal language. And why should a universal language be used between domain experts and software developers? Because right from learning about the problem statement, right from trying to come up with the initial solution implementation to actually getting something out there, there is a common language, there's a common interaction, and this helps reduce a lot of communication barriers, and hence the recommendation. Now in DDD, what do you actually do? Now we're getting specific. Now we're getting into a little bit of the action space, as you might notice. And what's around the action? Well, first and foremost, capture the domain, the problem space. How did we do it is what I'm going to come to in one of my subsequent slides, in the next one or the one after that. Embed domain terminology into the code. So when people are looking at their own code, when developers are writing the code or others are reviewing the code, it should be a reflection of terminology around the domain. Remember, ubiquitous language as well. And it's important to keep the consideration of subdomains, the consideration of context, and so on. So I'll start with some insights, couple of insights. So this is something that you see in the standard recommendations of Scale Agile framework. And this is exactly how we have gone ahead and implemented domain-driven design in an organization. How do you really read this? Of course, from left to right. On the left-hand side, you see the description of the problem statement. You see what is there right now, what is there today, and what is it that we need to either simplify or make better. And this is something that we do in the form of an workshop, wherein the business team joins, the business owners join, they work together, they put this on digital whiteboards, and they describe all of this for all of us to understand. So this is really the starting step of the domain-driven design. A lot of vocabulary is there in this, which probably may not always be something that agile teams are comfortable with. So as a preparation for such an activity, what's important is that people are either put through a virtual session, or they are given some learning objectives, any which ways. Ensure that your team is familiar with what this terminology is all about. What does it mean by an auto web form, or who really is the consumer, what's a dashboard, and so on. So that's just for examples, but we have actually gone ahead and put our agile teams onto some sort of domain understanding, some sort of understanding of the particular business unit and business vertical. The architects participate in this as well, and the product management definitely. Apart from the business owners and the R&D teams, there is also the possibility of a host of stakeholders. Sometimes the head of a particular portfolio wants to be a lot more involved and engaged. So that person, or if it's more than one people who are responsible for particular tracks of work, they are the people who join this, they are the people who take it forward in terms of being live on the sessions, understanding, bringing their insights of how the problem domain is all about. So all of this comes into being with a beautiful confluence of people working together. Let me get into a little bit more specifics of this. So how did we do it? Now, how did we do it is, first and foremost, we started to model the problem space. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we got together, we brought about our business owners, we brought our R&D teams, we brought about the architects and technical experts, we brought about the stakeholders, and we planned half-day sessions with them, which were only and only talking about the problem space. And we do this once every few months since the time we first implemented it, because there might be changes, there might be things we want to pivot and the likes. There is no sophisticated format to this. It's like what you saw in the previous slide. It can be, looking like a picture on the left-hand side. That's good enough too. But we really ask people to create a visual understanding of it as to what is the problem space that we're trying to go after. Extremely important point, and which is why I'm spending good enough airtime on this, because this is very, very important. If you are a coach who's looking to implement domain-driven design in your organization, please give this particular aspect a lot of focus on having people prepared, participating in such a session. Don't go crazy over whether people know a particular modeling language or not. They can just put it down the way they feel comfortable. It's not about getting the perfect model out there, but rather it's about getting the problem statement perfectly plotted. And then when we have outlined the first vertical on the left-hand side of the screen, we start to then think about the implementations. So from the problem space come strategic themes, epics, features, stories, the way you want to organize. Typically, this is what is recommended and very widely used. But otherwise, in general, have your different levels of segregation inside your implementation space, inside your backlog, because it also, a strong implementation really, as they say, starts with having a good backlog that's granular, that's really split up into epics and the likes. And the important thread, the important link, if that's not very explicit from the picture in front of you, the very important link is different elements of the problem space will form your epics / strategic theme spaces, how you want to organize or how big and small things are and the likes. But nevertheless, it's important that there is a correlation between these two. Now, in one of the teams, we have gone ahead and performed a correlation between the problem space and the initiatives as well, or between the top level goals and the strategic themes. So it just depends on how you want to structure this space. But really the key takeaway for all of you, in my honest opinion, is to look at here's where we want to get, and this is how it maps to the work we do. This correlation is extremely, extremely important. The next topic, and that is what happens periodically. So these three typically happen in a round robin every few months. If there is a scale agile implementation, it's always nice and interesting to give a glimpse of this when you are in your PI planning. A little before that, maybe get into a session where you at least model the problem space during your inspect and adapt iteration and the likes. So irrespective of when you're doing it as a logical step or a cadence, my recommendation is do it periodically. The reason being, there is going to be disruption coming from outside. There will be changes. So model is not imprinted in stone. Problem statement is not imprinted in stone. As and when features get delivered to end customers, there is customer validation. Customer is the boss after all. So you will have changes to what you do and implement. And hence, do this more often than not. And last but not the least step in one pass of this is to collaborate. Now, what would be different mechanisms? So the first and foremost is when new things get started to plan off, start with this as a step, start with the problem statement correlated to existing or new strategic themes and epics, and look at all kind of development around it. How does it really map? If there is something which is already defined, make sure you are inviting your key stakeholders and business owners in the form of demos and alpha beta validations and the likes. So again, basis what you have inside your acceptance criteria and definitions of done at various steps, it's important to just understand that this collaboration is really the key of domain-driven design implementation. So do this periodically, do this often, rinse and repeat. I'll give you a quick glimpse of one aspect, one example where we have implemented it. I definitely have more than one though. But here's what I would like to look at. This is one space where we have tried to do a lot of domain-driven design implementation. We started with our problem statement was very high response time to settle insurance claims. And then we modeled around this, if there is, so what's different again, when we modeled this, modeling a workflow for insurance claim might not be as tough, but really modeling it from a customer standpoint is where you need to bring the distinction. So assume point in time as T, that I as a customer enter into the system for receiving insurance claims, to the time that I actually get my claims honored. What is that time? That's the first aspect to look at. Second aspect is, what are those touch points from a customer standpoint? Do I have multiple touch points? What is the information I need to give? What is the coordination, if at all, that I need to do to ensure that all of this is honored? And so, the distinction is in here to really look at what do I undergo as a customer. So two things that we focused on from an non-functional requirement perspective. One was ease of doing business with the company, complex workflows in terms of time taken. Okay. So remember your NFRs, and that's something I would love to repeat n number of times in my presentations, because this area really deserves the attention, and I always have a strong feeling that in product development, we give very, very less attention to our non-functional requirements, and hence just imprinting this again and again. And then when we had this laid out on a mural board, what did we do next? We put things onto our backlog. Epics reflected our problem statement. Features implementation represented what we want to do next. And we put all of this representation, and then we started realizing. So this was a solution level implementation. This had to do with more than one train and the likes. And most importantly, development and domain experts work very, very closely. Last but not the least, host of continuous integration initiatives. And I'll come to that as well in the what were the key learnings from a DDD implementation. So from that time where there was complex implementation, the customer had to enter records and information probably more than once. And there had to be physical intervention behind sending pictures and screenshots of what had happened to a particular car if there was a car crash. 2, online workflows. There was no need anymore to visit any office or agency for handling claims. So a lot of technology also made it possible. Yes, completely agree. Without that, it's not going to be technology, as in on the software implementation side, as well as how do we really make quick pictures and understanding of the car crash and the likes. All these things definitely made it possible, made it easy. But the distinction again was to really look at starting with what does a customer undergo when a claim is really filed for or requested for. So in a nutshell, what were our learnings? First and foremost, we all understood that product development is iterative. I know we have seen this before. This is not rocket science, but really to take product development as an iterative cycle also means working in short sequences, taking things out to the customer, getting the validation done, measuring the promoter scores, understanding if customers are really happy about something or not, and then coming it back to research and development for taking it further. So all this cycle was definitely done more than once. And that's why it's important to, it's easy to read on the slide, but extremely difficult to implement sometimes. But let's understand, don't get into an excitement of delivering everything that's there on the backlog at once. Important is to collaborate, development, domain experts, business owners, we call them business owners in this particular context. They need to work together. Again, sounds very, very easy putting it here, but it is not as easy to get people together. They have their own timetables, they have their own engagements, availability, interest levels, understanding of how the process is going to be all about, and the likes. Easier said than done, but if you can do this, your outcomes will be phenomenal. Don't give up the ubiquitous language. Talk in ubiquitous language at all times. It's important that people understand it on both sides as a similar thing. You might reach challenges wherein developers might not always be domain savvy. They might not be the end users of the software either. So they've never seen it in action. They don't know how it looks like or what are the problems it poses. So it's just more than okay for these things to happen, but increase the domain competence of the developers than giving up on this. Integrate continuously. Very, very important. We had our solution demos. For the example that I just presented in front of you, we had a solution demo every 2 weeks. Even if it was one step ahead, even if it was some features that were only partially complete, but everything that had made it to the pre-production server, at least, we were continuously demoing this every few weeks, every 2 weeks. So again, very, very important. Last but not the least, which I didn't focus on as much because it deserves an important elaboration by itself. Architecture needs to be layered. So we all, primarily understand the importance of layered architecture, and it's important to keep the layers segregated to a great extent. So the entire domain should fit into one of the layers. There's a model layer of the architecture in which this entire understanding of the domain and the problem statement should fit in. Don't spread this understanding. What I mean by this is the UI should predominantly be more focused on the UI aspects. Don't mix the UI and the business logic and the likes. Don't do a lot of mix and match in this space. It's really important that you keep it all segregated. And that's why it's very, very important to keep the domain really centered inside one layer of architecture. Of course, I'm not an expert in layered architecture, but this is one thing that I have learned from my team and my system architect, that without this, implementing DDD would not have been possible. And with this, I would like to open the floor for questions. A couple of my favorite things that you should definitely get into. There is the link from Scale Agile framework. That's very interesting to read. It talks about domain modeling. It really puts domain modeling in very, very easy terms. And it's really nice the way it's written. So I definitely encourage all of you to read this article. Domain-driven design fundamentals. This is a nice course by Julie Lehrman and Steve Smith. Again, very, very interesting. It's available on Pluralsight. Apart from the n number of books by Eric Evans, the references which I shared in previous slides. So with this, Rohini, I guess we can look at how it...
Sure, Meghna. Yeah. Thanks a lot for the session, Meghna. It was fantastic delivery. So I would like to probably just read out the questions for you. The question number 1, how DDD connects with NFRs? Any examples to help?
So definitely, DDD connects with NFRs very greatly. And again, it lies in the, in the start of it. So when you're defining your problem statement, that's the first place you should start thinking about your NFRs as well. And think of it not from an implementation standpoint. Think of it from a customer standpoint. You probably might not get better in the first pass. Again, this is like a multi-pass process sometimes. It depends on how the implementation is. So start with it in the extreme left-hand side, I would say, when defining the problem statement comes into picture. The second place where you should think about NFRs and where DDD and NFRs connect to each other is definitely the way things are on your backlog. So you have your features, you have your user stories, both of which have acceptance criteria. Ensure that when you're doing these implementations, your NFRs are also in your thoughts in the form of a line item on the acceptance criteria. Definitely, I think that's a really nice place where you could put this. So inside the model as well as inside your backlog, I think 2 places where you definitely should look at. And the third place, of course, is, in terms of the validation with the customer. So even if you're not reaching there in the first pass, you can definitely keep going closer to reaching the final goal in terms of NFRs.
Cool. Thank you, Meghna. What differentiates DDD from BDD, as BDD also talks about common language terminology from tech and business domain?
Yeah, these things do have a lot of overlap, but it's all about, what's a good starting point. And domain-driven design explicitly starts with the domain. So yes, there's a lot of overlap with behavior-driven development. There is a lot of overlap with test-driven development as well, but the difference is in the scale. Okay, so when you talk about a full-fledged DDD implementation, you're looking at a much higher level. while your test-driven development and your behavior-driven development will come at, one or two layers of implementation below it. In the sense, when you are looking at your overall problem statement, when you're looking at the overall problem domain, that's where you start with your DDD implementation. While typically you get into a behavior-driven development angle or a test-driven development angle more in the features and user story space. So you're already one or two layers down. That's the basic implementation difference. Otherwise, they are very close to each other.
Thank you. So at what point of time do you recommend this vocabulary be established?
As early as possible. If you are already starting out with an implementation, fresh product implementation, it's good to start with this. But you might always have the situation that you have proceeded with a few things. There is a product out there, and now you're trying to churn a new feature or a set of features. So even if you do not have the liberty to start with it when you're starting with your product development, at least when you're introducing a change in your product or going ahead with working on a new feature or a set of topics or anything new that comes to your backlog or some sort of maintenance, at least start at that point in time. Even if you did not start with it when you actually conceive the product. It's always, better late than never.
Cool. Thank you. Is it possible to share a real-world example of DDD for some domain, either now or later? It will help understand better on how it coexists with HDD, BDD, and TDD.
Okay, so I will have to get some permissions if I want to share the mural by itself. But I'll definitely look at if that can be done, if there's no other implications around it. So apart from that, I think the difference to a BDD or a TDD is something which we already covered in the previous question.
Cool. Yeah. Isn't DDD about how we model our application, which means how we structure our services? Mm-hmm. What is the scope of functional areas? Wouldn't the product design leverage DDD instead of DDD driving the product design?
So if you talk about product design leveraging DDD, you are getting a little bit reactive. That's the difference. And how do you get proactive is, this is what is the problem my customers are facing, and I will design a product around it. That's how DDD prefers to look at it. But starting with product development first, here is my product, and these things will be done by the product. So what happens is there is a certain philosophical difference, and that gets reflected in the way you start working on it. It's because I have this, I'm giving this. It should be the other way around. Out there the customer is looking at this, so I will provide XYZ things. So a typical example is we have seen two ways broader organizations and product development react in the current pandemic space. For example, the current time that we have pandemic, we do have companies which have fared really well in providing what the customer deserves or requires or faces, right? So we have a set of companies that are doing that. Again, I would not advocate any one in particular, but just giving you a few examples. So we have, we have the Genie service from Swiggy, for example. So Swiggy was for a long time really known as a food delivery partner. But in the current space, it has launched a new service because customers really require that kind of a service, and because the revenues on the other side definitely were not going to be as same considering the pandemic situation. While we do have seen, again, I'll not quote names, but with the description, you'll be able to really understand whom I'm talking about. So we do have organizations which have perished in the current space because they have been so very structured in their product development approaches that they're not ready to look at anything in the problem space. So the whole idea is, instead of a product development organization which says, I have a set of features and products, I'll sell these to the customer. Instead of that, I go to the customer today. What does the customer need? The customer is probably in need of something entirely different because people are not commuting anymore. And, the very good example I can quote in that space is Asian Paints. So Asian Paints very recently launched something called as Viro Protect, I think it's called, and that's a sanitizer. And it's a very interesting shift between what Asian Paints used to focus on earlier and what it has added to its portfolio now. And so when you see organizations shifting like this, those are your examples to understand that, yes, they are more structured on your problem space as a customer than saying I have only these set of products to provide. So I think it's a lot philosophical difference. And when I call it a philosophical difference or a mindset, it is reflective of how you do product development as well. Yeah. So that's the change in the paradigm that's needed.
Yeah. Thanks, Meghna. In the interest of time, I'll just take one more last question. Sure. What are your thoughts about DDD relation to emergent architecture and design principles? Could you please share some concrete examples?
Definitely. So, I'll try to keep it short, but feel free to reach me offline through LinkedIn or the likes, and we can definitely talk more if somebody's ready and interested in performing more deep dives into the space. These two are very much endorsed together. So domain-driven design and emergent architecture really go together in very many respects. And why? Because they, again, both have the same intentions of starting with what is it that we are solving for the customer. And they have the intention of being iterative. Remember, we spoke about being iterative with product development. So emergent architecture also helps you build on top of only as much architecture as is available, and somebody can consume it. Only that much of architecture is what we build, and then we keep building on top of each other. So these are very, very overlapping. They endorse each other, and even on the Scale Agile framework in the agile software engineering space, you will find a good correlation of this two together. So there also you will find that your formal safe literatures and community pages do endorse domain-driven design. There's an entire page on domain modeling. So these are very correlated, and it's very useful to use them together.
Yeah. So Meghna, thanks a lot for your time today, and the session was great. I'm sure there's a lot of insights into the DDD itself, and then people can definitely reach out to you offline since we will not have so much of time to discuss further.
Sure.
We welcome you to have more sessions with you sometime later, and then participants, please appreciate your poll responses, and thanks a lot for joining today on a Sunday evening. We have the keynote session starting in a few minutes, so I will be stopping this live streaming, and we'll see you at the keynote session. Thank you once again. Thanks, Meghna, and the participants.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, bye.